Hi, everyone. This is the 20th episode of Mind Your Body, and I am so excited. I started working on this podcast back in January, and we officially launched in April 2017, and I'm just delighted to say that we are averaging over 1,000 listens per month. Obviously, I couldn't have gotten this far without my wonderful, generous guests, and of course, you, the people who listen to the podcast. I just really want to thank you all and take a minute to really show my appreciation for continuing to come back and continuing to listen. And for those of you who I've gotten to know so far, it's just been a pleasure hearing where you are in the world and what you do and what you're interested in learning about. And if we haven't connected yet, I look forward to connecting with you sometime in the future. So I'm looking forward to the next 20 episodes. And for now, to celebrate, I'm going to do another giveaway. So last month, I did an Elastoplast giveaway. And this month, thank you to Donna Newman-Bluestein, who was featured in last episode, episode 19. I'm going to give away a free Octoband. If you're interested in hearing the details of this contest, visit www.mindyourbodydmt.com and you will find all the details there. And this one's going to be shorter. It's just going to be 2 weeks long. So just make sure you check out the details really soon because the contest is going to end on the 24th of November, the day after Thanksgiving. It's real simple. It's going to be a really, really simple contest. Way simpler than leaving a review. All right, so let's just jump into today's episode featuring Kalila Homan talking about sensation and emotion from a neurobiological perspective. This is Mind Your Body, a dance movement therapy perspective on the integration of our emotional, cognitive, physical, and spiritual aspects of our being into one more aware and whole existence. Well, I just wanted to thank you for coming on to the podcast and sharing with us what you know about the mind-body connection. And I know that you've done a lot of research in this area. But before we get into that, I'd like to have you introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Kalila Homan, and I'm talking to you from Austin, Texas, where I have a private practice. And I'm also working right now in a couple of different alternate route training programs, including with Antioch University.
And can you kind of explain your focus or what you've been focusing on and for the majority of your career? I know I think you call it embodied neurobiology, right?
Yeah, that's the name of the training program, and it's the best description I could come up with. But I would say there is sort of a unifying theme in all of my work throughout my private practice and then any teaching that I do. I love that dance therapy really helps people work directly with their own bodies and develop their own bodies and their relationship to their own bodies as a healing resource for themselves that they can access throughout their lives. And to me, the fact that we have this capacity for a healing relationship within ourselves that just really needs awareness to be activated is a very kind of potent idea. And it comes to life in so many different ways in different contexts with anybody I've ever worked with, groups, teaching. I think that's the heart of it, is that we have this training that allows us to help people develop a more complex and grounded and versatile relationship with their own bodies. So, after you learn it, it's free and it's yours. And, you don't have to go anywhere for more, to pay more money. It's just something that you then own within yourself, which is pretty empowering.
Yeah, absolutely. So how would you define or describe what being embodied and then embodied neurobiology? Could you break down those concepts?
Being embodied, I think, means having the capacity to notice what you're experiencing on a physiological level. So, for example, right now I am sitting on the floor, but when I bring my awareness to my pelvis making contact with the floor and to my breath moving through my body, which are also approaches shared by mindfulness practice, for example, my experience shifts automatically. And within dance therapy, we also have both the capacity to bring the mind to the body as it's still, so that you bring your mind inside your body in a sense, but you also have the capacity to bring your mind to your body as it's moving. And all of life, all of our lives happen in the context of moving interactions with other people. So the more we notice how we're impacting and how we're experiencing those on a body level. For example, when I walk into a room, do I march right in, assume my place in this circle, and connect in the ways that feel really vital to me? Do I assume that I have that right? That's a very embodied experience. Going in, claiming your space, engaging with vitality in the ways that you want to. And other people need more time to engage. Perhaps they need to walk in a little bit more slowly, really assess the environment, figure out where in the room feels like a place that they'd like to be. Maybe they need more time. The more somebody knows about their own way of being in their bodies, the more they can navigate consciously the world around them in a way that makes sense to them and that is vital and flexible. If you know that you're going to have a challenge and that you tend to respond to that challenge, some people, for example, if something comes up, they might get more and more activated and talk more and more. And the more they talk, the less connected they feel. But it isn't until they reflect on it later, maybe with support, to see, oh gosh, the more frantic I felt, the more I moved, the less I felt connected. Like maybe if I slow down, I might feel like the other people are with me more. Just a small example. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it has a lot of daily applications. Well, it does. It's just noticing them and figuring out how to use that awareness to support yourself to grow in the ways that you want to.
Yeah, I often think of that as being controlled by your body and your emotions and your thoughts, which, are all intertwined, versus having more control over your entire neurobiology, neurophysiology.
Right. That's an interesting point. I worked with a young woman with pretty extreme depression. She had come from a kind of an overachieving high school, transitioned to a college out of state, and got very overwhelmed, and then kind of retreated into herself with a lot of different deflecting behaviors. And by the time we started working together, her experience of herself was, she said, as if she were under 100 blankets. And she just had both a depressed vitality and a depressed experience of herself. And amazingly, she had had some training early on in her life in dance that she was able to then begin to access as a way to move with that embodied sense in a different way. For example, pushing those blankets up off her took some strength and felt good to her. And she could use the floor as a solid foundation for that pushing to start. It was just a very kind of delicate, dynamic, and interesting process to watch her engage with her embodied experience of her own depression to find some new solutions to feeling more alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so then how do you relate all of this, the process of becoming embodied or being embodied, to neurobiology?
Mm-hmm. Well, I like to imagine the brain and the spine as having a large root system. And the root system goes, and this is actually a literal reality, is that the nerves then go to every single part of the body. And then the information flow comes from the body and the environment into the body and into the brain through the senses. And that includes the kinesthetic proprioceptive sense when we're like sitting on the floor, the fact that we can feel it. The information is coming from our bodies to our brains. And then there's a two-way channel. Of course, it's also coming back out from our brains to our bodies as we move both voluntarily and involuntarily. So it's just an incredibly intricate and beautiful system, and they are not separate. They are literally interwoven on a biochemical, molecular, structural level. The information flow is never one directional. It's always a process. I really like Daniel Siegel's definition of mind as an embodied and relational flow of energy and information. It's embodied and relational. Our minds are embodied and relational. We are not, even our minds aren't working solo. They're in collaboration. You and I are having a dialogue, and that flow and energy exchange is what's creating the reality that we're kind of simultaneously involved in, right?
Mm-hmm. Would you say that every thought has a coexisting sensation, a coexisting action, even if it's not like an obvious movement? Every emotion has a coexisting thought, and so on and so forth.
It certainly has a coexisting physiological reality. So a thought is a movement in the brain, and then it may extend into an action that then goes beyond the brain. Once it's an emotion, it already exists in the body, because emotion is kind of a complex molecular phenomena. It's not just in the mind. Damasio, Antonio Damasio, who wrote a number of books, but one of the ones I'm thinking of right now is Self Comes to Mind. And his concept of emotion really is that our experience of emotion is actually the mind's interpretation of what's happening in the body. Mm. So, for example, when we think of the emotion of sadness, there's a really different physiological state. If we feel into that sadness, we drop into it, we can feel the physiology of it. Contrast that with the physiology of anger or rage, the heat of it, the intensity of it, the rhythm of it. They're very different. And they're also different physiologically on both a biochemical level and then also a neurological level. And we have a number of kind of channels of information flow, one of which comes to mind that also has a strong physiological biochemical overlay is the HPA axis, something that many people might have heard about, but it's the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So in our own brains, we have the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands, but they are really linked also to our adrenals, which are on top of our kidneys. And when we get stressed, there needs to be a communication from the brain to the body to help the being respond to that stress. So it's an activating response. When something is stressful, we need to figure out how to respond to that so our energy spikes. And you can feel that adrenaline rush. You know, ideally, as soon as the stressor is resolved, the action has been taken, those levels drop back to a normal kind of a good equilibrium. When there is chronic stress and there's chronic overactivation, there's a difficulty in that recalibration process. So you might have somebody after a period of chronic stress being unable to access the activation that's normal and finding themselves in just a complete state of burnout for too long.
Would you compare that to depression?
Yeah, it could result in that, sure. There's a depression to the physiology of not being able to access the energy and adrenaline when you need it. It's a good way of thinking of it.
Is that what you were referring to just a few minutes ago when you're talking about the physiology of sadness?
Well, it's interesting because, sadness, sadness and depression to me feel different. Sadness has movement, the movement of grief, the movement of tears. When you see children crying, they may be sobbing intensely 1 minute, and then a couple minutes later, they're back. There's a process going on. It's a moving process in the body. And that is very different than depression, which may be an absence of movement, an absence of processing. In fact, when the person I was referring to earlier was able to start to access her feelings, disappointment, anger, rage, once she could really feel them as moving through her body, her depression lifted. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, I actually talked to Joan Wittig about this a few episodes back. For anyone who's listening, I believe it's episode 12. And that's kind of what she was describing, that, with depression, anyone who's suffering from depression lacks the ability to find some kind of energy.
Yes.
So I was thinking, with that example that you gave before, or even a different example, would you be able to describe, a certain sequence of movements that may have happened in session with you, and then like what the immediate physiological response was? So like I heard you say that the pushing of the patient before.
I'll go ahead with a different example. I had one person who was working on anxiety at work, even though she worked out in kind of a semi-public situation. She often had a lot of anxiety attached to that. And when it got very heightened, she would have certain uncontrollable symptoms that were very uncomfortable for her. One of which was that she would cough uncontrollably. And, if she really couldn't talk, she'd have to retreat and, recalibrate, et cetera. But it was pretty disruptive to her work environment. So when she came in, she had never really worked with mindfulness before, but we brought her awareness to her breath. And we, really followed the breath as it came in. She was able to allow herself to soften into the support of gravity as she breathed out. And then we kind of did a little research project looking for the pause at the bottom of the breath, and then noticing from that pause where the breath starts. And when you notice that point of in a sense, the origin of the breath, if you want to, you can do this along with us as we're talking about it. So breathing in, there's the expansion. Breathing out, you can soften into the support of gravity. And there's a little pause there at the bottom of the breath. And right from that pause, you can notice as the next inhale comes in. And that origin involves your diaphragm, which is exactly the part that was going into spasm for her when she was coughing. So she got kind of interested in that because she actually started coughing as she was talking about it. So then when we went through this cycle, she was able to drop down kind of underneath the spasm and allow it to soften, and her coughing dissipated. And it was partly because she wasn't in an anxiety producing situation, right? But that was the first time that she'd ever been able to, quote, stop her own cough. And she was kind of thrilled about that. So we said, well, let's just kind of take that into the next week and research that a little bit. If it happens at work or, outside of work, ideally where it's not as stressful, just kind of see if you can notice that the bottom of the breath, the way we found it just now. And when she came in the next week, she was pretty thrilled because it had worked for her a few times. And she described it as having like a secret power, meaning that nobody could see what she was doing. And that was really important to her because it was more of an internal experience in this kind of uncomfortable public situation. And so that's one example of being able to kind of bring your mind to your body and shift what's happening physiologically when it also may have an emotional component.
So would you say that, I mean, that's an amazing story, by the way. That's really an awesome example. Would you say that her emotion of anxiety was taking place sort of like, do you feel like, I'm trying to think of some words that might work. Like, was it stuck there? Was it just being held there in her diaphragm?
Well, it's interesting in this example, which is kind of rare, that we didn't go deeply into the emotions as much as we went deeply into the physiology, so that she could kind of create a sensory bypass. Because the emotions, the distress and the anxiety were just kind of looping around along with the uncontrollable coughing. And I've done this something similar with my son, who had some temporary tics when he was a child, and he really hated it because it felt embarrassing to him that his face would, move in ways that he didn't intend for. So then what we would do is just kind of relax and begin to investigate and see if he could find a different relationship to the sensation, like move it that same place intentionally, hold it for a second, and then let it go. Or if it was happening in his face, what would happen if he actually focused on wiggling his toes instead? So basically, you're creating a different sensory information for the brain, and then you're just giving it something else to do, like you're giving the nervous system another pattern to engage in. In those cases, I don't work directly with the emotion, because it's almost like a physiological response that is may or may not be directly related to the distress. Like this would happen for my son when he got nervous, but if he was thinking about being nervous, the more nervous he would get, right? So you just have to give him a little bit of control over this situation and then start to explore a little bit more. I think that's the cool thing about the body. It can kind of help you go into emotion, which is, I think, what you were getting at. And that's absolutely a wonderful resource. You can feel whatever is going on for you more deeply once you begin to include the sensations of your body. There's many, many times I've worked with people who are having trouble accessing a feeling. And then as soon as they go towards their awareness of their bodies, they feel it very deeply. And I think the power of sensory processing is you can also pull it the other way. If there's, in a sense, a flooding of feeling, and then there's an uncomfortable physiological response, you can almost train the nervous system to create another pathway as an option. So that's where I think the power of our work is so profound, is that it's so nuanced and subtle. It's not like an intervention can only do one thing. You can tailor it in 1,000 different ways depending on the particular context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm thinking of, I see a lot of patients who will restlessly shake their leg.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yeah.
a lot of times this happens in a group, so there's not much room for exploring one-on-one, but, they kind of say, oh, it's just something I do. It's just a habit. But what do you think is happening physiologically with that?
Well, I'm thinking of that kind of intense staccato type nervous system response that I see a lot in the legs. And if the person is interested, or even in a group, you might be able to bring that same pattern into another part of the body. For example, the arms, shaking the shoulders, something like that, something that just kind of gives the brain a different way to experience the pattern. Rather than maybe going directly to the legs and asking that to change, which you could also perhaps do after a warm-up by bringing in some kind of a movement metaphor that felt relevant, that brought in a whole different quality, like what would happen if we were all walking through water right now, so that there's a different kind of muscle tension that invites. But I think it really depends, as you are indicating, on the circumstance, on the setting, on kind of what is anticipated within the context, and how much surprise you can bring into that system without it feeling disruptive. So there's so many factors, right? That's why I guess it's called dance movement therapy, because we're always moving. And that's the thing I love about this field so much, is how many different contexts we are effective in. It's really something to think that the same essential protocol, which is just about helping people develop a more nuanced and flexible relationship with their own bodies, can work pretty much across the developmental spectrum, with any psychiatric challenge, with developmental challenges, cognitive challenges, and rehab. It's medical issues. I mean, we all have bodies, and our struggles have a embodied manifestation. So of course it makes sense to begin there.
Yeah, that's something that I wanted to bring up. Is I read in your article you had talked about, I think, prenatally, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you talked about some processes prenatally that I believe was trying to indicate that our minds and our bodies, even before we're born, are kind of working together in some sort of way. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can clarify.
Yes. When I think about prenatal development, it's kind of like being at the first origins of the whole universe, right? In 9 months, 6 trillion cells organize into our organs, our lungs, our brain, our heart, our skin. It's incredible that everybody finds their place and finds an integrated relationship to each other's cell in the body. The fact that is successful so often, and that it's in a sense an everyday occurrence, we forget how miraculous it is. And it is completely an embodied phenomena. And that's pre-birth, right? And then we arrive, and all of our growth from then on is in our embodied form, our embodied experience of the world. All the information that comes to us from the world around us comes through our sense of it, our embodied experience. So we are held, we are talked to, we are fed. Our bodies amazingly know how to integrate what they're taking in from the milk or whatever our first fruit is, which is liquid, and sort it out into useful material, and then let go of what it doesn't need anymore. I mean, all of these amazingly integrated physiological phenomena are, available to us. And from birth, we also begin to participate in our embodied experience of the world by, in the beginning, crying, by making it known when we have needs, how our needs are responded to, whether they are responded to, with what qualities of touch and care and sound we are held in the world. All of these make a huge impact on what we begin to anticipate, how we anticipate the world meeting us, how we anticipate our own energy being responded to. There are some very incredibly profound learnings that we're recording on multiple levels. Our memory systems are recording sensation, they're recording information. It's amazing how much, it takes to be able to say, stand up in the world, literally stand up for the first time. Takes so much work, right? At least 9 months of work typically. to get a body that can then find its way to standing. But then almost, every time after that, it becomes easier and easier and easier and easier. And all of a sudden we're doing this standing thing without even really thinking about it. That times, an exponential amount is how much information, implicit information, meaning implicit is we don't have to pay conscious attention to it, but nevertheless is there as accessible information for us. So we know how to stand. We know where to sit. We know how to hold a cup and bring it to our mouth. We know how to drive, many of us as adults. We learn that skill. And then as soon as we learn something and we don't have to pay as much attention to it, it is embodied knowledge, implicit knowledge. That process is ongoing throughout life. We have access to new information, also through our bodies, new experience. Somebody looks at us differently. Somebody experiences us differently. We then experience ourselves differently. That happens in therapy, in falling in love, in, finding a new wonderful friend. We're constantly growing, and this growth is always through new embodied interactions with the world around us, building on a foundation that's pretty solid by the time we're adults of embodied information that has preceded where we are now and becomes implicit, less consciously available.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I'm thinking about that example of standing up, and that we're carrying experiences from those very early moments all the way to present day.
Yes.
And so would you say that, based on what we were talking about earlier, how all of this is connected, we're carrying emotions from, our first years of life?
Sure. And those emotions kind of get translated into anticipations about, will I be met with kindness? Is the world safe for me? Is it a place where I can be loud or ask for what I want? Or is it a place where I need to keep myself inside, not expose too much? Those are kind of profound questions about ways of being in the world that are actually have their templates in very, very early experience.
And they change the way we are functioning inside, like our physiology?
Our physiology, and also how that's expressed in the world. So we may become hesitant people or very careful, both according to our temperament, but also how we are responded to when we do try something new. We may be, highly activated and then temperamentally, and then we either learn how to regulate that and, in a sense, develop some confidence in our own ability to settle ourselves and then learn, or a tougher situation, we may be negatively responded to for this very active self and not learn how to organize our own experience or how to settle in. So that nervous system may have still to learn how to focus, for example. If you have adults who aren't really paying attention, because in a sense, the adults around a young child are helping that child learn how to be in the world, in their bodies, how to be in their own nervous systems. It is an incredible training period from a nervous system perspective, from an embodied perspective. So what happens in early life, how a young person is responded to by caregivers, is setting quite a neurophysiological template for that young person. I'm excited about a new film, The Moving Child, that is coming out in our field and really speaks to this in a beautiful way.
Mm-hmm. Is there a way that people can see this movie?
Yeah, it's available online now. You can download it for a one view, or you can actually get, I think, a DVD version of it. A wonderful student of mine, Hannah Kamea Kemble, made this movie. And if you Google the moving child, you should be able to find it.
So I'm getting that the parent or the caregiver trains the nervous system of the child that they're caring for, and that speaks to emotions, of course. Do you think that also, like, how does that form personality too? Is it in the movements? What do you believe that kind of like forms the tiny thing?
I think that's a wonderful question. From my experience, children are born with an energetic temperament, and then how that temperament is experienced and related to is what helps shape kind of flexibility and the capacity to be in that body in an effective way in the world. So you might have a baby who's really loves stimulation. I had one of each, so I really know what the difference is. With the second one, who was more extroverted, we couldn't go on an airplane without walking all up and down the aisles, face out, so that he could say hello to 300 people, because he would be restless without all of that facial contact. It was literally the opposite from the first child, who would have been just completely overstimulated by that same experience and was much happier kind of snuggling in, facing in, got easily overstimulated. So like that primary difference between loving external stimulation or needing that to be very thoughtfully regulated. Babies come in with their own kind of styles, and how the caregiver can help that baby, for example, for the more internal one, begin to enjoy stimulation and enjoy engaging with the world in ways that feel manageable and rich. And, then as the baby's ready, increasing that to maybe a little bit more, or going outside, that kind of thing, versus the other one where you're also wanting them to have the capacity to self-soothe and kind of turn inward and tolerate being alone for a little bit every now and then, or, getting really engaged in something with themselves. So, yeah, I think it's a very kind of nuanced process. It's kind of dialectical, both within the self and in relationship.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I read that you wrote in your article was that our minds have the ability to disconnect from our bodies in the face of stress.
Yes. Yeah. I love the quote by Mabel Todd that says, man alone can be afraid all the time of what has happened, of what is happening, and of what may happen. He thus ignores the wise workings of the body. And that just, in a way, says it all. It's like, I think we have real vulnerabilities neurologically as a species. In a sense, because of our amazing intelligence, our left brains really have the capacity to travel forward and backward in time, to do all of this incredible planning, to do, these abstract thinking is literally a disembodied neurological phenomena. Our right brains are much, much more integrated neurologically through the body. In a sense, they cannot become disembodied. And then we have we have two simultaneous ways of thinking and being and making sense of the world happening in our own brains at the same time. And then those are bridged by the corpus callosum, whose, in a way, primary job is to kind of keep them separate, rather than, there's more GABA, which is kind of a slowing neurotransmitter in the corpus callosum, than there is glutamate, which would activate that flow of information. I think partly keeping our hemispheres separated is an important evolutionary function, because our brains are so incredibly complex. We literally cannot pay attention to everything at the same time. However, that also results in some vulnerabilities where we can just spend all day, on the computer or planning, and literally forget we have a body, but that has its own challenges, right? Then you really can become quite stressed out or over anxious. And you then need maybe some support in re-engaging the resource of the body, which you can do by bringing your awareness to it. And that's where we end up with embodied neurobiology back again.
Right. So do you have any suggestions or simple advice for people who are listening? Like what's the first step that someone can take alone?
Sure.
Towards becoming more embodied?
One thing I like to do is just when I'm in that place of overthinking things, which it happens to all of us, I like to remind myself that, my brain is a part of my body. It actually has a weight and a shape. And if I bring my mind to it, I can imagine its existence within my skull. And then I imagine that my spine is a very long tail for my brain. And I might remember that my brain is actually floating, which is true. There's a literal continuous flow of cerebral spinal fluid that helps to nourish our brains. It helps to cleanse our brains. It also helps our brains to literally float. If you bring your spine to really nice balance, you can get to that place where your head feels kind of light. And that is the functional weight of the brain when it's in right relationship with the spine is just 2 ounces, light as a feather.
Wow.
In a way. And at the same time, the literal weight of our brain, if you hang it forward, you can feel, wow, that is heavy. It is big. It is, 2 to 3 pounds of weight. But because of this beautiful flow of cerebral spinal fluid that's cleansing and protecting and nourishing our brains, and also keeping us afloat. So that can be a nice little mini reminder to appreciate the beauty of what's going on inside.
Yeah, the visual of that was therapeutic in itself. And it made me think how much posture probably has such a, I know there's a lot of talk about this posture and
yes.
But in that context, how posture can make you feel that much heavier or that much lighter. And I kind of like, at least in my own experience and people that I've worked with, is like, especially with depression, it feels heavy, like a lack of energy, a lethargy.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that there's such incredible beauty in our physiology, and the metaphors that come from that are also really lovely. I mean, the literal fact, but also the metaphoric sense that we have a little mini ocean inside our minds that's literally generated from the brain. The brain generates 6 ounces of cerebral spinal fluid, and then there's a continuous flow. So that is generated 4 times a day. So we've got like a little mini spring inside our own brains. And then, I mean, just the complexity and the richness of what's already true and what's already going well inside our own bodies, I think can be really nourishing for people, and then can help support them to return to their bodies as a place that feels kind of comforting and rich and welcoming.
Speaking of the flow, the fluidity in the body, what about like shoulders are kind of a popular area where things kind of feel stuck. It's common to hold a lot of tension in the shoulders. Yes,
that is true.
And what's your take on that?
Well, I like to remember that we actually are mostly water, literally about 78%, something like that. So if I start to imagine my whole body as a little bit of a water balloon, then I'm kind of can pour water from here to there to somewhere else, just kind of get spongy again. It can really help me with some of that chronic tension.
Nice. Those are some nice visuals.
Yeah. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm glad I got to see you.
Yeah, me too. This was really, really helpful, and some complex ideas that you put in a very relatable way, in a way that I think translates and can translate to, a wide range of listeners. So
absolutely. Well, thank you for your podcast and getting that word out there.
Thank you. Thanks for contributing. All right, that was our 20th episode. Thank you again for listening. And to be entered into the free Octoband contest, visit www.mindyourbodydmt.com. Or if you're already a member of the Facebook page, the details will be right there too. This contest will be over on November 24th, so you have 2 weeks to enter. Good luck!